So we're going to be having David Niose speaking in a few, and just wanted to let you know that we will have a little bit of time for question and answer. So because we're a little bit ahead of schedule, so we have a little bit of wiggle room. But before that, I'm going to invite Pat McCann up to do a introduction, and Pat McCann is from the Hartford Area Humanists, a newer humanist group.
Well, so far I've had 3 jobs today. This is going to be my favorite one, introducing the Hartford Area Humanists. But I'm the social media guy behind S.A.N.E, so if you guys are following us on Facebook or Twitter, feel free to comment or make suggestions. You'll get our support. I'm also the IT support for the speakers. I didn't know that was going to happen until I came in this morning. Helped out a bunch of you guys get your things on. But the Hartford Area Humanists are a chapter of the American Humanist Association and members of the Secular Coalition for Connecticut and Connecticut Coalition of Reason. Our organization was founded in the first half of the year, and I'm really amazed at how fast we've grown. We already have about 85 members, and I think there are 2 big reasons for that growth. I think one is the excellent leadership of Dan Blinn and a lot of the other members. The other members that are on the steering committee doing a great job putting together a lot of diverse events, and I'm just going to give you a flavor of some of the things that we do. So probably primarily is our charitable / community support, which includes events like our work with Habitat for Humanity, the Light the Night Walk, supporting the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society that we participated in 2 days ago. Our team so far has raised $1,600. And we're in a heated race with the Vista Vixens, so if any of you want to donate, please feel free. This coming November, we'll be volunteering at the Hartford Food Share to help feed the less fortunate. We also organize hikes and walks, followed by stops at local eateries in places like West Hartford Reservoir and Manchester, and our upcoming hike to Hubline Tower. We host social dinners where we just go out and have a meal and enjoy each other's company, and I know we're not going to change the world, Dennis, by doing that, but it's building that sense of community. But my favorite events are our dinners where we have speakers that we host in Rocky Hill. Some of our speakers have included the likes of James Hughes from Trinity College, who discussed what neuroscience reveals about the physiology and neurochemistry of happiness, morality, self-control, and transcendence. We've had David Schaefer, one of the founding members of the Humanist Association of Connecticut and signatories of the Humanist Manifesto 3, who talked about the process behind its creation and how it relates to the first 2 Humanist Manifestos. We've had Dan Zanatro, president of the Connecticut Valley Atheists, who gave a talk on whether humanist values should lead us to a vegetarian lifestyle. Go vegans. Tommy Raskin was a winner of the American Humanist Association essay contest in 2012. He's a very remarkable man who was at our last dinner with a wisdom well beyond his years. He recited actually some of his very interesting and topical poetry, and I highly recommend that you read his winning essay if you have a moment. In our upcoming meeting in November, Dave Schrader is going to be talking about the social aspects of permaculture and its importance to building community. We also organize field trips, like our trip to support the kickoff of the Yale Humanists, and we're going to be looking forward to going to see the Book of Mormon at the Bushnell. We also host discussion groups and participate in the UU East discussion groups that have topics like the cutting edge of science, humanism and the supernatural, and rational spirituality. And who can forget our pig roast fundraiser for S.A.N.E. You can find out more about our organization at our website, hartfordhumanist.org. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. I got to keep plugging that. And meetup.com. And we have sign-ups at the table outside, so if you visit our table, feel free to sign up. So I said in the beginning that there are 2 reasons for our rapid growth. The other reason speaks to the needs of the community. We all know there are many people out there living without religion who just aren't aware that there are groups like ours where they can simply just be with like-minded friends and build a sense of community together. The Hartford Area Humanists meet that need in the north central part of the state. And this also underscores why gatherings like S.A.N.E are so critically important. Even though we didn't get a lot of publicity in the local press with the billboards, the word is spreading. And speaking of spreading the word, it is now my distinct honor to introduce our next speaker. He is the immediate past president of the American Humanist Association and current president of the Secular Coalition for America, the national lobby representing the interests of atheists, humanists, agnostics, freethinkers, and other non-theistic Americans. He blogs about humanist and secular issues on psychologytoday.com. He is the author of Non-Believer Nation, The Rise of Secular Americans. And if you haven't read his book yet, in my humble opinion, you cannot say you're fully informed about the extent of the issues facing the secular community in this country. And as if this isn't enough, he has a day job too. He is the lead counsel for a case that is in front of the Massachusetts Supreme Court arguing that the under God phrase in the Pledge of Allegiance is a violation of the state's constitutional ban on religious discrimination. His unique approach is arguing that it violates the state's equal protection measure and not the U.S. Constitution's guarantee of the separation of church and state. David lives not too far from here in Massachusetts with his wife and 2 sons. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me give a warm welcome to the good Dave, David Niose.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you for that nice introduction. I'm just kind of happy that you didn't say that I was buck naked the first time you saw me. You know, nobody watching this on YouTube is going to know what the heck I'm talking about if they didn't see Jessica's thing first. But thank you, and thank you for everyone who helped organize this. I know there are quite a few individuals, so I'm not going to start singling out people, but to all those individuals and the 7 or so groups, right, that helped put this together. I think it goes to prove that you can herd cats, right? So, but I want to talk about a few things. The secular movement in the context of this Massachusetts lawsuit and the kind of activism that we've been doing in recent years in the movement. There's really quite a bit to cover, but I guess I have a little bit of extra time, so I'll delve right into it. It's always nice to be able to talk about something that I know a little bit about. The secular movement in this lawsuit would certainly qualify. It kind of reminds me when I first started blogging for Psychology Today, the very first article that I wrote, I co-wrote with a psychologist because I'm not a psychologist. I never got past Psych 101 in college, but somehow I'm blogging at Psychology Today. But I wrote an article about teen sex from a humanist standpoint. And all of a sudden, word was out there somehow that I was an expert on sexuality, which is, you know, I'm a tort lawyer from Central Massachusetts. It's really not my specialty, but I was actually asked to go around speaking about this article in teen sexuality. They flew me out to Boise, Idaho to talk about this. So I just thought it was hilarious because I'm far from an expert. I said to my wife, you know, they think I'm an expert on sexuality, and, you know, she laughed. And I said, well, you know, you don't have to laugh that much. But anyway, the secular movement is something I know a little bit more about anyway, and I do want to share a few thoughts. There are a few things that were said early on, and I want to kind of address those right off because I think they're quite relevant. David Silverman's point about the importance of identifying as an atheist is, I think, very important, and this comes from someone who is president of the American Humanist Association. I think for too long, there have been camps in the secular world. There's the atheists over here and the humanists over here, and a lot of humanists didn't like to identify as atheists for many years, going all the way back to John Dewey. Really, if you read Non-Believer Nation, you'll get a little bit of this history, but for decades and decades, there was a tendency to think that, oh, we can't identify as atheists. And the excuse that's often given, it irks me. People will say, well, I don't like to identify as a negative. You know, no, we can't identify as a negative. Well, I ask these people, you know, do you identify as a non-smoker? Do you identify as anti-war? Oh, yeah, well, then you're identifying as a negative. At least be honest about it. Okay, if you're not going to identify as an atheist, be honest about it, that you just don't like that stigma that comes along with atheism. But I think more and more in the movement are realizing that, yes, I'm a humanist, and I usually identify as a humanist whenever I can because that's who I am. But I also identify as an atheist. I don't believe in God, and that qualifies me as an atheist, if you will. And I think people need to come forward with that. Humanism is never going to really take root in this country if atheists are stigmatized and vilified. And I think more and more you're seeing that in the movement, that on the AHA board, when I first got connected with the AHA back in 2004, there were many on the board, the vast majority really, who would not identify as atheists. Now I think everyone on the AHA board proudly identifies as atheists, and they realize that this stigma and this vilification has to end. So that's just one way that the movement has changed in recent years, and I'll get into some more. Let's see. I wanted to also point out that there's a couple people here who were directly helpful in this Massachusetts lawsuit that I'm going to talk about. Two people who actually provided affidavits for the court in connection with this lawsuit. This suit was very well prepared. We had the AHA's legal department and people involved in helping out putting this case together. And we really came into the case, as I say, armed for bear. You know, we were really just loaded for bear, so to speak, coming into court with a very well-prepared case. And two people in this room, Barry Cosman and Jessica Alquist, both provided affidavits to help us out with the case to prove various points that we were making, demographic points on Barry's affidavit. And with Jessica's, she provided us with an affidavit about an anecdote that I don't think she talked about in her talk, but I want to mention it to you now because it really drives home the point of what we're dealing with in the secular movement today. Jessica, after she brought her lawsuit down in Cranston, Rhode Island, was standing for the Pledge of Allegiance with her class one day. And of course, this is right after the suit was brought, and she was already being kind of vilified and you know, pointed to as the bad guy in all of this. Her class, at the opportune time during the Pledge of Allegiance, several students turned away from the flag to face her and shout "under God" at her. Okay, this is one nation under God, Jessica, right? To let her know, you're an atheist, you're an outsider. And this affidavit of this little anecdote was put before the court, and I can tell you it was quite persuasive, because the other side in the Pledge of Allegiance case, if you've ever been involved in this litigation, they insist that the under God wording has nothing to do with religion. What are you thinking of? No, 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 no. It's a reference to our heritage, an allusion to our history and the political philosophy that this country was founded upon. I find it very interesting that the parties arguing this are not the American Historical Association or the Society of History Educators, that they seem disinterested in this reference to history. No, the parties arguing that under God is not religious are religious advocacy groups, such as the Becket Fund, the Knights of Columbus, of course, they're directly responsible for inserting the language originally, the ACLJ, founded by Pat Robertson and led by Jay Sekulow, Alliance Defense Fund, the Family Institute. These are all the entities arguing that under God has nothing to do with religion. A group of congressmen entered the lawsuit on an amicus brief, about 3 dozen congressmen, led by Michelle Bachmann, who we all know has great interest in American history and philosophy. It's just comical. It really is. And I think the court could really see through it. And I know the court was certainly touched by Jessica's story. The other side tried to keep the affidavit out. The tactics of the religious right, it's just, if you're into the legal stuff and maneuvering, it's just really hilarious. The lawyer comes charging you, he says, well, she's not even from Massachusetts, Your Honor. You know, Cranston, Rhode Island is like 5 miles from the Massachusetts border. I argue, you know, what is there, a dome of enlightenment over Massachusetts that children in Massachusetts could never act like this? You know, I mean, obviously. In fact, Cranston, Rhode Island is closer to Acton, Massachusetts than about half the municipalities in Massachusetts. So anyway, the affidavit did not get kicked out. And as I said, I think it was one of the most persuasive affidavits in the packet. So this is what we're dealing with anyway, and I want to get into it a little bit more. I'd like to back up a little bit, though, and I'll just start by telling you a little bit about myself and how I got involved in the secular movement, because I think it's kind of relevant to all of this. Like a lot of people, I have no interest, really, in debating the existence of God. I mean, you know, you get a gin and tonic or two in me, and, you know, maybe I'll change, and maybe I'll want to engage in that kind of debate. But for the most part, if I'm not sitting around with nothing to do, I really don't choose to throw my life and energy into the direction of arguing God's existence. I think what really got me involved in the secular movement was concern about social and political issues and the direction that this country has been going since about 1980 or so. I guess you would call my politics are left of center, you know, kind of social democracy. I'm interested in, I'd like to see American public policy go in the direction of social justice, economic justice. I think corporate power is something that is just not even discussed in this country, and it really needs to be. Well, I'm not going to walk on water, but anyway, you know, butter over guns and, you know, the usual issues that I think a lot of people in this room probably feel somewhat sympathetic to. And the reality is that in America, I don't think that's what's been happening in recent years. Since about 1980, things have really changed. Not that before 1980 everything was hunky-dory. I mean, we had problems with imperialism and social injustice and all that stuff. But I think before 1980, one could have looked at what was happening in this country and think, well, we're hopefully going in the right direction. You know, there seems to be an increasing understanding of the general direction we need to go. But with 1980 and the rise of the religious right that year, led by Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, everything really took a right turn, quite literally. And we started seeing more and more public policy that was just anti-human, is the way that I describe it. I think I would say anti-people, but since corporations are people, I guess it's kind of pro-people, but it's anti-human. And that was what I saw as the real problem. And it was the election of 2000 when George Bush ended up in the White House. Notice I didn't say he was elected in 2000, but there was the election of 2000 that resulted in George Bush getting into the White House. That really was the final straw for me. I think up until that time, I thought the religious right, although it had been growing in power, had to be a passing phase, would sooner or later just die out because things like this don't get traction in the long term. Surely it will go away and things will return into a direction of sanity. But with Bush in the White House, it really hit home with me that, wow, you know, this phenomenon is not just going to go away. Whatever we've been doing to oppose the religious right and conservatism and pro-corporate public policy, it has been failing, and we really need to do something different. And my conclusion was that what was failing is that the secular demographic had just been completely marginalized, that reason and rational public policy were so far from the acceptable political spectrum that something had to be done. And the way to reverse that was to advocate on behalf of secularism and the secular demographic. And what I really thought is that what was lacking was an identity-oriented thrust to this, I would say, the secular movement, but there wasn't even a secular movement. But we needed a secular movement, and we needed to make sure that it had an identity-oriented thrust, so this marginalized demographic could kind of emerge into public light, if you will. And it was 2004, I ran for the AHA board, and I was met on that board, as I said, by a bunch of people who wouldn't even identify as atheists, and I thought that was very interesting. And since around that time, though, I think several other people who have gotten into the movement, David Silverman being one of them, he suggested that there's a real contrast between our approaches to secular activism, but I'd say about 99% we're on the same page, although he has the bad Dave reputation and I have the good Dave. That might have more to do with personality than policy positions. I hope he doesn't watch this tape. But anyway, what I really thought is that we needed an identity-oriented secular movement, and a lot of people thought the same thing. And you heard a lot of people talking, and you still do, about the whole idea of how we needed to model ourselves after the gay rights movement and the LGBT movement, right? I think there's that whole concept of coming out of the closet, of not being honest and not being open, and having a demographic that is very much marginalized and vilified. The analogy's there. And I know you can only take analogies so far, and I know there are certainly sharp differences between the LGBT movement and the secular movement as well, but I do think the analogy carries quite far, and there's a lot to be said for it. So, anyway, so we start off this path of identity-oriented activism. Well, how do we do it? Well, one of the first things the AHA did was to start running advertisements. The AHA had been around since 1941, okay? And despite that, you really had an organization up until that time that shunned the atheist identity and in fact really shunned non-theism completely. It had never ever conducted a national advertising campaign of any kind to promote the idea, never mind even atheism, but humanism. What the AHA's approach to activism was up until that time, and the community in general, was to advocate for progressive issues, because humanism is a progressive philosophy, right? But to do that along with other groups that are progressive while hiding the non-theistic aspect of humanism. So you saw the AHA very active in reproductive rights and women's rights and even church-state issues, but not by advocating for atheism or non-theism, but just by arguing church-state, because we should have church-state separation, that sort of thing. So at this point in time, there was a kind of a decision made, no, we need to assert the identity more. We need to do this identity-oriented activism. So one thing that we decided was to take a look at our litigation strategy, and why aren't we using atheist identity, humanist identity as part of our litigation strategy? And that's what eventually led to this Massachusetts lawsuit. And I just want to kind of describe it a little bit for you to distinguish it from other lawsuits. And the best way to do it is this, is if you ever think about when minorities assert their rights in court, okay, whether you're talking about racial minorities, ethnic minorities, women, when there's a group that's being discriminated against, the route they usually use through litigation is an equal protection route, okay? Classic case would be Brown versus Board of Education, right? To desegregate public schools. The argument is that there's discrimination happening, there's a group that should not be discriminated against, it is being discriminated against, that's unconstitutional, it's got to stop, end of case. That's how Brown worked, and that's how other cases like that go. If you think about it, though, atheists and humanists have never used that equal protection approach. What do atheists and humanists typically do when they go into court complaining of a problem? They point not to equal protection, but to the First Amendment, right? The Establishment Clause. That's where we go. Church-state separation. When Jefferson talked about the wall of separation between church and state, he was talking about, of course, the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. Now, that's great when it works, and it often does work. Classic cases from the 1960s during the Warren Court, you've got the Engel versus Vitale removing prayer from public schools, and you've got the Abington School District versus Schempp case, removing Bible reading from public schools, and there's a whole litany of cases now under the Establishment Clause that stand for the notion of church-state separation. Well, that's great, like I said, when it works. But there are problems, especially lately, using the Establishment Clause approach. some of these problems would be, well, first and foremost, now we've got more conservative courts, especially federal courts, right? Having had a lot of Republican presidents over the last few decades, we've got a lot of conservative judges who view the Establishment Clause quite restrictively. In fact, now it's kind of difficult to get standing on Establishment Clause cases. So there's the problem of being able to enforce the Establishment Clause through conservative courts. Another problem with the Establishment Clause is you are inevitably going to be faced, when you bring an Establishment Clause case, with the question of, well, what was the framers' intent? You know, what were these 18th century rich white men thinking when they wrote this First Amendment? You know, Congress shall make no laws. Now, it's ironic because, quite frankly, their intent pretty much was absolute separation of church and state. I mean, they gave a little leeway and there was a little bit of a fuzzy area on some things, but these men were in favor of church-state separation. But what's really interesting is, if you think about it, when a racial minority comes in arguing equal protection, you know, nobody says, gee, you know, what would Jefferson think of equality for African Americans? You know, it's not an argument that seems to come into play very much. Or, you know, what would Adams think of equality for women? You know, I mean, quite frankly, as enlightened as these guys were for men who owned people and for their time, that they were enlightened for their time, I guess, but, you know, that they were not enlightened by today's standards of equality and pluralism and enlightenment, quite frankly. I mean, it's just not an argument that you'd see. What would the Founding Fathers think of equality for gays? Well, I don't know, but I can't imagine they'd really be too enlightened by our standards. So it's an argument that uniquely atheists must still face. Gee, what would the framers think of atheist equality? Well, you know, is it really a fair question to ask what these 18th century men would think? And as I said, ironically, of all those issues, the one that they're probably closest to the modern standard on would be equality for atheists, but still. And then a third thing that's very important about the Establishment Clause that we need to realize is that it is not inherently an identity-oriented remedy. Think about that. You could be a conservative Christian and you could still bring an Establishment Clause case to take a Christian cross off your town's public green. Why? Because you believe in church-state separation. That's why. There's no inherent identity component to an Establishment Clause case. In fact, that situation basically describes the Salazar versus Buono case, where the plaintiff Buono was a Roman Catholic. And he said, I want the cross hanging in my church and in my home, but I don't want it on public property. So there's no identity component. And that is, I think, quite important, especially when you follow the analysis through. So what we have done in Massachusetts is we have tried to apply these modern standards of equality rather than the First Amendment standard of the Establishment Clause to atheist equality. You know, isn't it about time that atheists come forward as a legitimate demographic group that deserves not to be discriminated against in America, in public policy? I think it really is just common sense. We have brought a case challenging a state law in Massachusetts that requires schools to conduct the Pledge of Allegiance exercise every single day, led by a teacher. We've brought the case in state court and challenging it not under the federal Constitution, but under the state Equal Rights Amendment, which is a provision in the Massachusetts state constitution that sets a very high bar, a very high standard of equality. If you think about equality law in this country at the state level, Massachusetts, with the Goodridge same-sex marriage decision back in 2003, was the first state to declare that it was unlawful to discriminate against gays and lesbians with marriage law. And that was a case brought under the Massachusetts state constitution. So it just kind of goes to show how seriously equality is taken in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So the real point of the case is that atheists and humanists are equal citizens, that it's not right to discriminate against atheist children. You know, no child should go to school every single day to have the school conduct an exercise that defines patriotism. These children are really, they're having patriotism defined for them by standing up, putting their hands over their heart, and having the pledge recited. And it's defining patriotism in terms of God belief. You're a true American, well, put your hand on your heart, and what do you say? It's we're one nation under God. That's what a true American is. Obviously, if you're an atheist, if you don't believe that, well, you know, we're a free country and you can stick around. We'll let you stay because, you know, we're good people. But you don't measure up to the real patriots, the real who can stand straight and tall and say that pledge. So it's basic non-discrimination law. It's basic understanding of how to treat citizens equally. And we think we have a very strong case. The case was argued the first week of September, so we're about 6 weeks out, and most decisions come down in about 3 months or less. So we're waiting for the decision, and we're hoping that it goes the right way. But the point I want to make is you'll notice that this litigation strategy is really an extension of the identity-oriented activism that I referred to earlier. You know, 10 years ago, humanist activism was getting out and, you know, helping women get into the abortion clinic while the fundies screamed at them. You know, that's still something that humanists do. The Greater Worcester Humanists actually has an arm that does exactly that. That, you know, we stand up for reproductive rights and we stand up for you know, abortion rights and that sort of thing, and all these progressive issues. We're anti-war. We're all those issues that have been important to humanists, but we're also emphasizing the identity-oriented aspect of it. That, you know, that you can't discriminate against atheists, and encouraging people to identify as atheist. And the litigation strategy really reflects that general philosophy very well. And we'd like to see it modeled elsewhere. You know, Massachusetts is just one state, but there are still 49 to go. So if we're successful there, or no matter what happens in Massachusetts, I think you're going to see the case brought elsewhere. Goodridge was just one case in one state, but look what happened after Goodridge, right? You saw Connecticut follow with a case of its own that legalized same-sex marriage. You saw Iowa, and now what are there, like 21, 22 states? So hopefully we'll start spreading the word about atheist equality the same way. And that's basically all I have, but I'd be glad to chat with you and answer any questions you might have.
We're going to do a little Q&A. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then when I point at you, then you can ask it.
I have a question about standing in terms of things like the one-pocket cross or crosses in public property. And it seems that they try to limit it to the city or to the municipality. And it seems that that's very restrictive, considering that every member of the state, in my view, should have standing for things like crosses around public property. What is your view on that?
Yeah, no, well, I would agree with you on that. I'm not so sure the law is that settled on that, that specific issue. I think if you're bringing a case like that, though, you want to make standing as little of an issue as possible. So while I think anyone who drives past that cross should have standing, quite frankly, and maybe even some who don't, you know, but I think certainly at a minimum, anyone who sees that cross on any sort of regular basis should have standing. If I were bringing the case, I would prefer to bring it on behalf of someone who lives in that community, and in most instances, you're probably going to be able to find somebody with the stronger standing, and you're going to go with that just to knock that issue out right away. You don't want to be investing time and resources into bringing a case like that only to find out that your client's connection to the cross isn't quite strong enough to give the client standing. Well, there's two questions there, whether I'm seeing more of it among those religious groups. And I do circulate somewhat among those groups, especially with the Secular Coalition, because we're a coalition of 11 groups, so I'm not circulating so much just with the AHA anymore, but with these other groups as well. And from what I do see, I'm seeing more of it, but I would qualify that by saying I tend to be circulating with people who are more active and maybe in leadership positions, so I think that could be part of it as well. Whether it's actually happening en masse, so to speak, I'm not so sure, and I don't know that I'm in a position. Barry would probably be in a better position to talk about how much people are identifying as atheists on a broader level. But how to attract those people, you know, the best tool by far that I've seen any local groups use is Meetup. There's just no better way to it. I think the biggest reason why there are so many more local groups than there were 10 years ago is that, you know, you could be out in the middle of, you know, rural South Carolina and start a meetup group, and you'll suddenly find out that there are a few dozen other atheists or agnostics even out there. And, you know, they want to go drink skeptically with you and do that sort of thing. So that's probably the best advice I can give in a nutshell.
And then right next door. I recently had the opportunity to hear and behind the judge in court, the Raymond, big gold was God we trust. What's that about?
Well, I bet most of the people in this room know the history of In God We Trust. It became the national motto in the 1950s, right around the same time that Under God was added to the pledge. It existed a little bit before then, but it wasn't the national motto. And I think it's a great indicator of how, if you let your guard down, the religious conservatives will come rushing in and legislate their way to privilege, if you will. In God We Trust, if you think about it, is actually a complete sentence. You know, it means we trust in God. It's just, you know, the wording's changed, but it is a complete sentence, and it has an unambiguous meaning. And again, the way they get around that is by arguing, well, it doesn't really mean what it says. That you know, it's again a reference to history and heritage and all that. I go into this in quite a bit of detail in Non-Believer Nation. I mean, I think it clearly discriminates. If you were to bring a case against In God We Trust, though, you'd probably have to do it at the federal level, unless you can find a state law that, and there are some states, I think Florida being one of them, where In God We Trust is actually the state motto as well. But where it is, the way we were able to challenge Under God in Massachusetts is by challenging a state law that required daily recitation of it, led by teachers, which really shows the state sponsorship of the exercise. The other side tries to argue, well, you don't have to participate in the exercise, so it doesn't discriminate against you. But that's obvious. An exercise can still discriminate against you, even if you don't participate. The fact that you get to sit and watch the class conduct this exercise that defines patriotism in religious terms means it still discriminates against you. So in God We Trust, you would have to find either a state law that, you know, for example, required signs to be put up in every classroom. Then you could challenge it at the state level. Aside from finding something like that, you would have to just challenge the federal law head on. And it has been challenged. I think Mike Newdow had a case a few years back where he tried to challenge it, but unsuccessfully under the Establishment Clause. It would be interesting to see a 14th Amendment equal protection, federal equal protection case against it, but there's a lot of nuance to that. The federal equal protection law on religion is a little bit murky. I'm not saying it can't be done. In fact, I'd like to see it done at some point, but you'd really want to posture everything and get everything set just right and then pull the trigger on that. Oh, okay. Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, David Niose.